It is a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. My name is Rabinow. I am the director of the Menil collection. And on behalf of the staff of the museum and our board of trustees, we're honored to welcome you as we remember the remarkable life of Fred Baldwin. He was our friend and our neighbor, and also an artist whose work is represented in our permanent collection. We have some examples of his work up front on easels, and we invite you to come up afterwards and take a look. We had hoped to gather together on January 25th, which was Fred's birthday, but the Omicron rise here in Houston was such that we felt it wasn't safe. And so we postponed our gathering by a month. I am sure that many of you watched the extraordinary online remembrance that was hosted by FotoFest, and we have FotoFest Executive Director Stephen Evans here with us this evening. Tonight's program, as I'm sure you know, takes place on Tuesday, February 22nd, 2022, or in shorthand, Tuesday 2/22/22, a rather unusual ordering of digits, which I'm sure Fred would have enjoyed and would have had something witty to say about. It's the type of detail that he loved. This program has not 2, but 4 speakers, and will be followed by an outdoor reception. Our first speaker is Don Carleton. Dr. Carlton is the founding director at the University of Texas at Austin's Dolph Briscoe Center for American History. Prior to the creation of the center in 1991, he was the founding director of the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, an urban histories archive program sponsored by Rice University, University of Houston, and the City of Houston. Dr. Carleton is an accomplished historian, author, advisor on historical documentaries and book projects, oral historian, and curator. He has built an important body of documentation, historical works, and visual images on the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, as well as on American and Texas history. He has known Fred and Wendy since the 1970s, when the couple began their Texas work. And in 2019, the couple donated their archives to the Briscoe Center. So it is an honor to welcome you, Don.
Thank you very much. Wendy, you honor me much by asking me to talk about Fred, your beloved Fred, today. So thank you for that honor. This is also a double honor for me because of the fact that my wife and I were married 50 years ago, well, not quite 50 years, but 48 years ago in the Briscoe Chapel. So that's also a very special kind of homecoming for me as well. Now, in speaking about Fred, please understand that he and Wendy were partners in every sense of that word. And although they did have solo projects. So as I speak of Fred tonight, I will also speak of Wendy. Fred and Wendy met in 1970 when she was working as a freelance photographer for Newsweek and New York Times and probably some other publications as well. Fortunately for all of us who love photography, that meeting with Fred led to a personal and professional partnership that continued until Fred's death last year. In 1972, Fred and Wendy conceived of and initiated an ambitious project, which they described as an effort to, quote, rediscover our own country, unquote. They started their journey of rediscovery in the American South, traveling in a camper towed by a 1957 Mercedes across Alabama, Mississippi, the Arkansas Delta, and on into East Texas. Fred and Wendy spent the next 15 years visually capturing local life and compelling detail They documented 3 distinct cultural frontiers in Texas: black and white life in Grimes County, the daily lives of descendants of German settlers in the Texas Hill Country, and the lives of Mexican working families in the Rio Grande Valley and the Big Bend area. As you've already heard, I first met Fred and Wendy in the late 1970s. I think it was maybe 1978, Wendy. I couldn't quite remember the exact year. Well, this was while I was organizing and directing the Houston Metropolitan Research Center in the Julie Idison building in downtown Houston. By then, Fred and Wendy were living in Grimes County, conducting their path-breaking documentary work. Now, I vividly recall, I can't remember the date, but I can certainly vividly recall my first impression of them when they came in. Fred, of course, was tall and fashionably dressed in his own distinctive way, complete as always with a scarf and pocket square. Wendy had, and she still has, a wonderful smile and an absolutely impressive ability to articulate their shared vision. They came to the Metropolitan Research Center to see if we had any archival resources that might be of use to their Grimes County project. I also recall noting how passionate they were about their efforts to visually document the social and political history of black and white residents in a county that was still dealing with the after effects of the violent racial and class conflicts that marked so much of that county's past. After the University of Texas at Austin recruited me to establish what is now the Briscoe Center, I kept in touch with Fred and Wendy, and I continued to observe and admire their work, especially in establishing FotoFest in 1983. Our personal connection for so many years was furthered by the strong friendship that we shared with the wonderful and unforgettable Miles Glazier, who was invaluable to Dominique de Menil as she worked to build this great museum. We also shared a friendship with the late Larry Goodwin, who wrote Democratic Promise, the populist moment in America, a history of the Southern Populist Party in the 19th century, which used Grimes County as a case study for populism. Off and on, throughout those years, I pestered Fred and Wendy, and I hope pleasantly, about placing their archive at the Briscoe Center. But at the time, they were too busy with FotoFest and other projects to give much thought to my offer. Fred and Wendy continued to work as photographers even as they labored to make FotoFest the great success it is today. During the 1980s and 1990s, they pursued individual projects, including Wendy's coverage of the effects of the herbicide Agent Orange on the U.S.-Vietnam War veterans. Together and individually, they continued their projects in Texas while also working as freelance photographers in Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and West Africa. For several decades, Fred and Wendy worked tirelessly to capture the rapidly changing character of American life, usually in great depth and detail. They've done so with dexterity, elegance, persistence, and remarkable patience. Their work illustrates an array of social, cultural, and political currents in American life since the 1950s. For example, early in his career, Fred photographed the activities of the Ku Klux Klan in Reedsville, Georgia. And in 1963, he began to document the civil rights movement, volunteering for Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference. His images formed the basis of the book, Freedom's March, Photographs of the Civil Rights Movement in Savannah, which was published in 2008. Fred Baldwin was an extraordinary photographer whose calling sent him and his Leica around the world on documentary assignments, from Arctic Norway to Borneo, India, and Afghanistan. A life story that Fred told so well in his recently published book, Dear Mr. Picasso, An Illustrated Love Affair with Freedom. In addition to their individual projects, Fred and Wendy's work has appeared in publications throughout the world, including Esquire, National Geographic, Life, the New York Times, Newsweek, and on and on and on. About 3 years ago, Fred and Wendy let me know that they were retiring from full-time involvement in FotoFest, and that they were ready, finally, to talk about the possibility of their archives finding a home there. So it must have been not too unpleasant, my pestering you, Wendy. So after a few visits, including a trip to Austin to tour the center, they agreed to add their collection to the extensive holdings that we've gathered in the nearly 30 years since we began our photography program. For me, Fred and Wendy's decision seemed like the closing of a circle that began more than 40 years ago when we first met at the Houston Metropolitan Research Center. To place Fred and Wendy's decision in context, let me briefly explain the Briscoe Center's mission and our initiative to collect the definitive archives of leading photojournalists and documentary photographers. The Briscoe Center is one of the nation's leading institutions dedicated to historical research. Our collections include archives measuring 84,000 linear feet of shelf space. That's 17 miles of shelf space. It's full of manuscripts, documents, and records, a 200,000 volume rare book library, 13 historic buildings, and our 3 museums in different places in Texas contain a total of 25,000 objects of material culture. The center's main exhibit spaces, classrooms, and public research room are located on the University of Texas at Austin campus, next door to the LBJ Library on Red River Street. You're all welcome to come visit us. In recent years, we've been involved in an ambitious program to become a major center for the history of the American news media, including photojournalism, as well as documentary photography. We collect the entire archives of photographers, including their negatives, color transparencies, contact sheets, prints, digital scans, and written and published work, all for the purpose of preserving this invaluable material for research. Currently, we hold the complete archives of more than 75 important photographers. Our photojournalists include Flip Schulke, Dirk Halstead, and Diana Walker, as well as Pulitzer Prize winners Eddie Adams, Lucian Perkins, and Carolyn Coe. Our documentary photographers include Russell Lee, Steve Shames, and Robert Polidori, among many others. And now they include the complete archives of Fred Baldwin and Wendy Watriss. The center has acquired all of these collections, which total more than 8 million images, because of their value as visual sources for helping us to understand the past. Photojournalists and documentary photographers record the visual reality of the moment, which quickly becomes history. That record often can be read, deconstructed, and interpreted like a written text. However, photographs cannot serve as evidence if they aren't preserved, which is why we are so pleased to have guaranteed the permanent existence of Fred and Wendy's work. Last year, as the United States finally ended its 20-year war in Afghanistan, Fred published an essay with photographs he took documenting his experiences in that country when he was serving in the Peace Corps in 1966. It is a superb example of Fred's outstanding skills as a writer and as a keenly perceptive observer of the details of daily life. I hadn't seen those photographs before that. I was stunned, but not surprised by their visual power. Those images, like all of those Fred and Wendy captured, alone or together, are outstanding examples of documentary photography and its great value to historians. All social historians share a concern for achieving a historical perspective on the everyday activities of ordinary people, people who otherwise would be lost to history. And Fred and Wendy have been masters at documenting social history and transforming the invisible into the visible. Not long ago, when Fred was looking back on his career, he noted, quote, "What was magical for me was that a little tiny camera could serve as a passport to the world, as a key to opening every lock and every cupboard of investigation and curiosity. It was also a way of taking me to places and situations that would provide me good stories to tell," unquote. Fred's wide-ranging work, both in terms of geography as well as subject matter, now has a home where it's going to be available to students, faculty, and other researchers. In the near future, the Briscoe Center will have an exhibition of Fred's photographs, as well as Wendy's, in our main exhibition gallery. Now, let me conclude by saying how grateful I am that I had the opportunity last November to escape my COVID-imposed house arrest. It's lasted about 2 years. This is the biggest crowd I've been around just in 2 years. So, anyway, I was able to visit in November with Fred and Wendy. Now, that visit gave me another opportunity to thank them for their decision to allow their archives to be permanently housed at the Briscoe Center. During that last meeting, and of course we did not know that would be the last meeting, during that last meeting, Fred was his sparkling and articulate self, eager to discuss his and Wendy's work to organize their archive before its complete move to the center later this year. And he was chock full of ideas about the possibility of new projects. That was Fred Baldwin, as I will always remember him, intensely aware of the past as we talked about his work in Afghanistan more than 55 years ago, and eagerly looking to the future. Rest in peace, Fred. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. I, too, am honored to have been asked by Wendy to say a few words. I met Fred and Wendy after becoming the director of the Mcneil collection in 2016. They warmly welcomed me to the Mcneil, which was especially meaningful for me, given their long association with the museum, its founder, the neighborhood, and Houston's cultural community. I will always remember that first dinner that my husband and I shared with them. We hadn't even begun the main course when all of a sudden, clear as day, I understood that Fred and Wendy were extraordinary, unlike anyone else who I'd ever met before. Name any topic, any geography, no matter how obscure it might seem to you, And not only did they have something fascinating to say about it, if it was a place, they had likely been there. My memory from that evening is of a couple who was brilliant, generous, funny, and well-informed. World travelers with an international network and outlook. Among his many remarkable qualities, Fred Baldwin possessed significant amounts of intellectual curiosity and compassion. In the op-ed about Afghanistan that Don just mentioned, that he wrote just a few months ago, Fred explained, he said, quote, "As a photojournalist, I survived by learning from the people who I interviewed and photographed," unquote. He was deeply interested in those around him. He was generous of spirit and inclusive, committed to civic life and social justice. He was also brave. You know from his autobiography and from the photographs that you're seeing that he would do anything to get just the right photograph. He was not opposed to chasing down polar bears in the Arctic or jumping into schools of migrating codfish in the North Sea. Similarly, he steeled himself to follow a Ku Klux Klansman whose car, decorated for a rally, he happened to stumble by accident. In the autobiography, which I assume that most of you have read, Dear Mr. Picasso, An Illustrated Love Affair with Freedom, Fred recounted the momentous day in 1963 when he witnessed a civil rights march in Savannah. With his camera always at the ready, he began taking photographs, and soon he volunteered his services to the Chatham County Crusade for Voters. He was a self-taught photographer, and after this experience, he found himself making photographs in a new way for a cause that he knew was right. Wendy will tell us more about how she and Fred came to know Dominique de Menil and call the museum campus home. In 1975, Dominique presented an exhibition of Fred and Wendy's work at Rice University. In 2014, the Mcneil collection exhibited selections of their photographs, which ArtNet described as, quote, politically engaged, powerfully composed, and still vivid. Soon after that exhibition, the Menil acquired for its permanent collection a group of 61 photographs by the couple. Images of some of these appear in the slideshow, and as I said, we have several on easels here at the table next to me. For decades, Fred and Wendy's gray and white house facing the Rothko Chapel grounds has been a hive of creativity, vision, and energy. Inside, Fred and Wendy, collaborating as they often did, produced numerous books and exhibitions. One of these books, looking at the U.S. 1957 to 1986, was reviewed by Jim Casper, the editor of Lens magazine. He wrote, "This book is an important reminder of the power of photography and personal activism and how it can affect positive change." The book contains a beautifully written essay by Xavier Canon, as well as his interview with the couple. In it, Fred explained, quote, "We were both explorers of the world and adventurers in different ways. We became photographers when the photographers of our generation and the previous generation were generally self-taught. The camera was a tool and a passport to the wider world." In many ways, FotoFest, which Fred and Wendy co-founded in 1983, along with Petra Bentler, was an outgrowth and expansion of their international interests and activism. They recognized the potential of photography to be more than simply a framed artwork hanging on a wall. They understood that photography could be used to combat literacy deficits in local schools. They saw the impact that they could make by introducing the work of emerging photographers to a larger audience. And they appreciated the importance of making connections between writers, curators, and photographers at all stages of their careers. Fred and Wendy understood how to be agents of change. They recognized qualities in Houston that appealed to them, just as John and Dominique de Menil had decades earlier. They embraced the city's can-do spirit, and they understood that there was room to expand the cultural landscape. Fred and Wendy envisioned FotoFest as an organization with global outreach that would befit and benefit a global city. The idea excited funders who found their international vision thrilling. Fred and Wendy set out to deepen their existing connections and create even more. They were curious to see how contemporary artists around the globe used photography as a medium. And then, every 2 years after extensive travels, they welcomed the world's photo brilliance to Houston. The FotoFest biennials were no small undertaking. To fulfill their vision, Fred and Wendy deputized hundreds of volunteers. They tirelessly advocated for the city to support FotoFest efforts, explaining that Houston would benefit not only from an increase in tourism dollars, but also from invaluable business and intellectual connections. The city's cultural sector continues these important conversations to this very day. Fred and Wendy's ambition for FotoFest led to collaborations with institutions across Houston. A critic from the Washington Post marveled that the 1998 FotoFest biennial, for example, included 90 exhibits, he wrote, spread across Houston's numerous museums, galleries, alternate art spaces, corporate lobbies, restaurants, bars, and even a funky mobile van. This camaraderie of the arts institutions surprised national critics. And even now, many consider this collegial spirit unique to Houston. For Wendy and Fred, no logistical challenge was too daunting. This power couple could move mountains. Fred and Wendy, children of diplomats, photographers, activists, citizens of the world, connectors of people and institutions, ambassadors of the human spirit. We miss Fred, his wit, his intelligence, his keen eye, his ascots. How lucky we are to have his extraordinary legacy to sustain us and inspire us. It is now my great honor to welcome Wendy.
Well, it's daunting to try to compress 50 years of partnership in 20 or 25 minutes. I'm trying to keep to Rebecca's schedule. And thank you all very, very much for coming. And I hope Fred is appreciative of all the attention that you're giving him. He would approve. Our partnership is a story of discovery, of adventure, and an existential creative vision that marked both Fred and myself, personally, individually, and collectively. We used to say to each other, when things were going well. 1 + 1 = 3. Two people who had lived and worked around the world and spent the later years of their lives in the most unlikely of places, Texas, Houston. First, Fred's personal story, and then a collective one. I begin with a picture that I took of Fred after the first FotoFest in 1986. We were going to talk at the Rencontre d'Arles, and then at the Mois de la Photo, and acknowledging them for their inspiration for FotoFest. France has been often an inspiration for very creative things. It's my favorite picture of him. I see it defying age and time. It is the face of aspiration, someone unafraid of life and ready for the challenges of venturing forth to new adventures. As you all know, he was an adventurer, a man of wit and idiosyncratic humor. Tall, distinguished, kind, and often infuriating, he got around more landmines than anyone I know and was utterly delighted with himself. Senator Richard Russell, who LBJ called the Lion of the Senate, irascible and not given to frivolity, opened his office to Fred after hearing Fred on a payphone describing how tracking polar bears in the Arctic could improve the military's knowledge of the Soviet nuclear tests in Novaya Zemlya. The result? A personal recommendation from Senator Russell to the Secretary of the Navy and enough funding to support the next polar bear trip. Fred sees the awkward paper rolling about here. I thought I had, okay, I thought I had the picture of Fred and the MG, but okay. His later adventures started in calmer places: Florence, Lausanne, the Bahamas, small town Virginia, Charleston, and Savannah. He pronounced all these names as if he had lived in each of these places all his life. He had a privileged upbringing. Can you hear me if I'm not speaking directly into the microphone? Okay. With parents who brought together two wildly different versions of the world. His mother, a deep belief in the sanctity of the Southern upper class. His father, an utterly cosmopolitan perspective of how to engage in life wherever you are. His father died when Fred was 5. It set him on the search for Picasso. Our partnership emerged fortuitously out of peripatetic childhoods, rebellions in boarding schools, and a search for the best ways to break out of caste and class, while hopefully keeping in touch with the best of them. We coincided on most of these things. When people ask what appealed to me about Fred, I would often say, if I were lost in the wilderness, I would want to be with Fred. He understood how to survive. He knew how to find solutions. He was cool, witty. He knew himself, his strengths, and most importantly, his weaknesses. He was quite fearless, as some have said, but usually not reckless. That is, most of the time. Wait till you see a few of these photographs. His stories were infectious, sharp, and funny. He was very engaged with life and more than willing to take physical risks. I have now learned a lot about Fred by listening to how other people saw him. Two events that were very, very important in his life were first the Korean War. Let me get back one. He was a Marine rifleman. Most people of privileged backgrounds go to officer training school. Fred wanted combat, and it actually got out of a non-combatant assignment to do this. And subsequently, he was in one of the legendary battles of the Marines, the Trojan Reservoir, when U.S. troops, primarily the frontline Marines, but also Army and British forces, were trapped behind enemy Chinese lines, outnumbered 12-1. Temperatures were below 45 degrees. Marines were living in open foxholes. Can't call a Marine a soldier, those of you who are Marines here. It required weeks of climbing tall, high mountains to get to North Korea and the Trojan Reservoir as the Chinese came over the border. Korea meant more and more to Fred as he became older, and the one group of people that he remained intensely loyal to was his squad from Havana. He went to Savannah, which was the city that he didn't particularly like, every year, and he sent money to them. The next important visit was to Picasso. It was after the Korean War, and he was in Columbia after having had a very uneven career in all schools, both preparatory schools and colleges. But he finally realized, as he said, to get any interesting woman, I had to be able to talk properly on many subjects other than how to kill people. He thought if he could see Picasso, he would be connecting with his father again, because physically they had many things in common and a wild sense of humor. However, it was at a time when Picasso, living in La Villa, California, was not seeing strangers, seeing very few other people than his own agents and family. You have to read the book to get the whole story. But Fred did use his imagination after being ejected from the door at least 4 times, and found that he could probably appeal to Picasso's sense of humor, which he did. And on the 5th try, Picasso said to his daughter Maya at the door, "Où est l'Américain? Je veux le voir." And he spent the day with Picasso. And from that time on, he realized that if you had an idea and you could use your imagination and you took action, you could probably succeed. One of Fred's first documentary projects, which he wishes now he had spent more time with, was, as Don said, a chance encounter with the KKK outside Pooler, Georgia, southeast Georgia, on his way to actually photographing a tobacco auction. But he stopped. And in his best Southern accent, which was actually very good, normally he had no Southern accent, He asked if he could photograph them, and they asked him if he was with Time magazine, and he said no, and they said, well, okay. This was, I think, early 1950s, if I remember, I'm not sure. I deliberately did not put any captions on these. It was a KKK rally in Reedsville, Georgia, which is one of an endless series of small, forgotten, and at that point in time, economically depressed towns in Georgia. And one of the things you see if you look at a number of these pictures, particularly the one on the left, you do not see people in the United States that look like this anymore. People that came out of James A.G. Walker Evans' Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. We're too well nourished these days. And this was really a 24-hour project, which Fred should have spent another 6 months on if he had been an experienced photographer. But one of the things he said, which always has caught my attention, often the first thing he says about this encounter was, it was clear that most of the white KKK followers realized that the only thing they had that separated them from their African-American counterpoints was the color of their skin. This was the beginning of a foray of projects near the Arctic in Scandinavia, and a series of projects that Fred now did describe as an egocentric trip, going to places where nobody else would go and doing things that nobody else dared to do. So the first of them in this extraordinary place, Kautokeino in northern Norway, was a 6-week trip with the Sami reindeer herders. It was thousands of kilometers between where the reindeer ate and nourished themselves in the summer months and slowly began a long winter trek back to their breeding grounds. And these were thousands of deer. And as far as I know, no one else for decades did a story like this. Oops. And they had very, very elaborate clothes, beautifully sewn jackets with red design. The men, of course, particularly. But the women did as much hard labor work as men. And these reindeer, this was a 4-kilometer water crossing that they had to make to get to the breeding area. Oops. And this is where they lived and slept, and Fred did the same, and with very smelly dogs that would rub up against you at night. And the trip itself, I think to get to the crossing took nearly 3 weeks. And one of the things that Fred said he often learned from people like reindeer herders, people very different from the people he grew up with, is how cleverly they adapted to their environments. A reindeer herder leader could tell by the shape of stones half covered by snow, looking at them in a blinding snowstorm with wind, if they were on the right track or not, over hundreds of kilometers. This was not a physical adventure. This is another kind of adventure, the Nobel Prize in medical physiology. And these are the Swedish princesses before the ceremony. The ceremony and the official photographers waiting outside the ceremony. Fred sort of, he didn't steal credentials, but he fabricated credentials. And he had met one of the US winners of the Nobel Prize and formed fast friendship, and he was able to get into the ceremony. The King of Norway is on the left back, and one of the princesses. An aunt of the Queen. I'm not sure who the man is. And this was the Dr. Beadle, the Nobel Prize winner in medical physiology, showing his award to Fred. And this is a assembly of two of the polar bear trips that Fred took. The first near King Carl's Land, which is probably 400 miles south of the North Pole. And this is an Arctic fox on ice floes. And this is summer. You couldn't go up there. I mean, now you can with the icebreakers, but at that point in time, you could not. Now, this was a point of recklessness. This was a 35-foot open boat that these three guys, Fred on the left, took up for a 3-month trip, essentially in one of the high Arctic places north of Norway. This is Sapphire, a very favorite bear of Fred's. She was a young female. And on the right is my favorite bear, Big Bear. That's all this, Big Bear. Look at the size of those paws. And this was a rare year because often you don't see groups of polar bears gambling, playing with each other. And this is on the second trip, thanks to Senator Russell and the Navy, of tracking how polar bears swim from underwater, whether they paddle and use their front feet or use their hind feet as propellers. They use their front feet or front legs. And Fred, who had no formal training underwater, or he was a scuba diver, but he borrowed equipment from the Norwegian Navy and did a lot of the underwater shooting. And they did provide Senator Russell with some radiation information that was helpful to the military in terms of determining how serious the nuclear tests were that the Soviet Union was conducting. Another point of ego, Fred met a wild Texan. I think only Don Carlton here would know him. He was an architect, very idiosyncratically conservative in Austin, A.D. Stenger, who gave John Henry Falk a house, remember? And he went down to Texas to see A.D. after the first trip. And A.D. took him boar hunting, and then told him about the Myers Ranch near Coahuila on the Texas-Mexico border. Mr. Myers boasted that he could provide the Mexican cavalry with 1,200 matched white horses. There were so many wild horses in this area. It was not a gentle breaking. All the vaqueros, of course, were Mexican. And this was the next most reckless thing Mr. Baldwin did. He always admired Hemingway for all the reasons that you might suspect, and was very much taken by Old Man in the Sea. So he decided that he wanted to photograph marlin that had been caught and the fight they put up underwater. I mean, they're huge. They will go down 300 and 400 feet and come up again and so forth. But you couldn't do it with underwater diving equipment. It didn't allow you to be flexible enough to follow the marlin. And the marlin is slashing with the bill and so forth. And when the water calms down, there are sharks surrounding this, because although this photograph doesn't show it, a lot of blood in the water. So Fred was doing this with scuba equipment and just going underwater, his old breath, and coming up again, and hoping to God that the sharks wouldn't see him. And this is a dying marlin. And it sobered him a great deal to see these magnificent animals being caught, really, by the dozens in the Sea of Cortez, which is sort of a trap for them when they're young. It's a lot of nourishing food there, so a lot of deep-sea fishermen go there. But after this, things changed. He went back to Savannah. It was after the last Arctic trip. And he found the civil rights movement and the voting rights demonstrations that were being sponsored by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he became interested in them. And then he met Hosea Williams, who, those of you who have followed civil rights history, Hosea was a very close friend of Martin Luther King's. He had been in World War II in some very famous battles, and when he came back to the United States, he couldn't drink in a public drinking fountain. That radicalized him, and he was one of the most strategic and important and little-known leaders of the civil rights movement, and he was conducting, with students, the voting rights demonstration in Savannah. And I can't imagine what Fred's mother was thinking. She was of the old elite in Savannah. But he volunteered for the SCLC and photographed them for over a year. And in the curriculum that we've been working on with the film that we did, thanks to Francine Neely, about this work and our work in Grimes County, we are using some of these pictures to show students how relevant and important they can be if they become engaged in their society. I think I missed one picture. No, I guess not. Hosea Williams is in the foreground of the picture on the right. These are young voters, would-be voters lining up to register at, of course, the right ages. This was a vote mobile. And very important to the movement in Savannah were the longshoremen. And Big Lester, which is on the right, and who's on the right in the vertical picture and showing the pamphlet of Martin Luther King, was key. And what Fred discovered was that in a number of smaller towns like Savannah, the civil rights movement recruited some of its best volunteers and its best workers from union leaders, a number of whom were rumored to have been murderers in their past life. And as Fred would say, you wouldn't say no to Big Lester on the right here. This was actually a photograph. We think the Menil owns it. I'm pretty sure they do. But it was also given by the Baker Institute to Obama when he came here to talk with James Baker. This encounter with the civil rights movement changed Fred's work and life as a photographer. It also led to his work in the Peace Corps in Borneo and a number of the islands in Malaysia. And I don't know if Jeanette and Ben are here. Are you here? Well, here you are. Young Texans volunteering. And he did a whole story about Jeanette and Ben and their work, agricultural work in the upland villages upriver. And I think this is Jeanette talking to an assembly. Yep. Because this is what was happening. I mean, it was happening in 1963, 64. So you can imagine what it is today. He then went to look at the Peace Corps projects in India and Afghanistan. The Afghanistan work is particularly strong. This is going into Afghanistan from Pakistan and approaching, this is the lowland before you get to the Khyber Pass. This is the Khyber Pass, where many nations have met defeat. And this is one of the road checks, customs houses, as you're coming down from the Khyber Pass. You can imagine and see how difficult it is to monitor. And these are small roads and towns outside Jalalabad, which was the center of quite an amazing experimental Peace Corps project, where retired doctors, pediatricians, there were 2 pediatricians from Connecticut here in their 60s, and assistants came to train medical assistants in Afghanistan. According to Fred, it was an incredibly successful project in a small town, which is probably the kind of projects that the United States should have been supporting in our long history there. And these were people lining up to get in the clinics. Women were not necessarily wearing, not masks, but anyway, scarves over their faces. And were allowing doctors to treat them, male doctors. And when I met Fred, he was working, he'd come back from the Peace Corps, and he was working with a doctor on poverty in southeast Georgia. This is the Savannah River. And Fred and I, this is the early part of the project in 1969-70. Fred and I went back 10 years later to do a story together, which I wrote, and the conditions were not much better. And these were conditions in hollows and around swamps and lakes which had absolutely no medical treatment. And he and the doctor did manage to get $600,000 from the McGovern Committee to put a clinic for both white and black in Beaufort. And then we met in 1970. I never remember, 70 or 71. Fred this was going between central Texas and the Hill Country with his, Don neglected to say, the cabriolet is handmade. Mercedes only made 300 of them. So you see the other part of Fred's background. And it was ignominiously pulling an $800 trailer, which I like to call a camper because I thought it was more genteel. But and then he photographed me in the Big Bend area. We did three, I'm going to show you a few pictures from three what we call cultural frontiers in Texas. Texas was opened just at the time when colonialism was becoming very important in Europe. Those who hadn't gotten in very early, like Germany, were looking for open lands. And then planters from the Tidewater South, who had already worn out cotton lands, were looking to Texas, which had quite extraordinary river bottom land from the Brazos, and in this case in Grimes County, and the Navasota rivers. But the Brazos River, north and south, provided very, very good cotton land. And what most sort of people that have grown up in the oil era don't realize is that Texas wealth was based on cotton. And cotton is still, or Texas is still, one of the largest cotton producers in the United States. Now, it's a much less valuable crop now, but in the 1800s and up to about 1930, it was the crop, and it gave Texas its wealth. So I think it's something like 18,000 planters from Virginia, from Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, came into Texas around 1820, 1830 to farm the Brazos bottomlands. And of course, with them came large numbers of slaves. Grimes County was one of the largest cotton-producing counties in Texas. I could talk all night about the racial situation in Grimes County, which hasn't changed that much today. Fred and I went up there to do a slide presentation for them in early 2020, before FotoFest 2020. And the man on the left was one of the last tenant farmers in Texas, actually. He was of Polish origin, Sandalski. And these counties were very stratified, with African Americans on the bottom, Poles not much higher. Then there were Germans in Grimes County as well, who came in as craftspeople. They had skills. They were better. And then it became where you went to church as a white person, whether you were considered elite or just regular. And Mr. Sandalski here is picking cotton. And Fred and I spent a day picking cotton, and believe me, it is one of the worst tasks I can ever live. Because if you don't know cotton, the cotton bolls have these very sharp spines at the ends. So you have to really be skillful. I mean, you have to wear gloves. But the really skillful people knew, and so that's why women were very good cotton pickers, to get inside those bowls to get the cotton out. It was backbreaking, painful, terrible work for which you were paid nothing, and tenant farming which was the mode of farming throughout the South until the late 1950s, was not much better than slavery in many cases. And the man on the right is a farmer whose father, in a very unlikely situation, managed to go to the courthouse in 1890s, probably because the courthouse was being run by populists who had relationships with African Americans, and there were black deputies then, and had a will, which he was able to leave 300 acres of pretty good farmland to his family, and the family still has that farmland. But most black farmers avoided the county courthouse at all costs and did not have wills, so no protection on their land. Small towns throughout East and Central Texas kept Juneteenth alive ever since the 1800s. The cities like Dallas and Houston discovered them later when it was politically correct. This was a Juneteenth parade organized by 3 families over 3 generations in Anderson, Texas. And they did not celebrate the 4th of July. They would take off work and they would go picnicking or seining for garfish. But Juneteenth was their holiday. And it was very clear, although integration was just beginning to take hold in the new 70s, that schools and organizations like Little League were the only places where there was really shared interrelationships between white and black. And it really taught me the importance of schools. Because by and large, after school, if there wasn't Little League or something like that related to schools, whites went back to whites and blacks went back to blacks, and that's just the way it is today. And I think Menil has that print out, the one on the left. Often on an important Sunday, 2 preachers would come together. Most of them would come either from Bryan or Houston, because small black churches, of which there were many in Grimes County, couldn't afford to keep a full-time preacher. Again, as you can see on the right, that's a school outing. We found very, very few social occasions where there were blacks and whites together, either in church or songfests or weddings, anything. And of course, there was a big cowboy culture, and Fred and I really discovered and did several national articles in the 70s on the network of black rodeos throughout Texas and Oklahoma. And there was a famous one down South Maine called the Diamond L Ranch. It was quite a remarkable place. And there were ropers in 4 acres. Where is 4 acres? That's not the right. Acres Home in North Houston, which traditionally has been a black, rural black, particularly World War II. Blacks came to work in the defense industries and settled that area. And there were a lot of rodeo cowboys up there. This is the German Hill Country. When we were there in the 70s, these people were still speaking German at home. They could speak English, but they were more comfortable in German. And as Robert Caro said in his first book on LBJ, Anglos didn't know how to work the hill country. It was very deceptive. It's beautiful, but the topsoil is that thin. So you couldn't grow cotton or you couldn't grow cash crops. And it certainly wouldn't support slavery. But the Germans who came from small family farms in Germany, they knew this kind of work. And they put fences up. They learned from the Mexicans how to raise sheep and have very good sheep and Angora goat industry. But you can see what the country is like there. And it's very interesting. The hill country at this point in time, and up till probably 10 or 15 years ago, were small R, what I call small R Republicans. They were conservative, but they understood the importance of government. And in the mid-1860s, they wrote a program of how government should be involved in the civic life of communities. So they have a very good hospital, or did have a very good hospital, very good music organizations, and pretty good schools. They believed in public schools and state support of infrastructure and public education. And on the edges of the hill country, well, of course, it's 4-H club, but are big ranchers like Charlie Schreiner, YO Ranch, now famous for its longhorn. That's Reagan Brown, the agriculture commissioner in Texas, and Charlie Schreiner riding his longhorn through the dining room. He's now famous for his exotic game, Pat's Dance Hall. And the Texas-Mexico border from southeast, the Rio Grande Valley, to the Big Bend, southwest Texas. The vegetable fields in southeast Texas. Very similar today what they were 30 or 40 years ago. These are the colonia that I'm sure many of you read about. This is the housing development built for farm workers. No running water, no electricity, no roads. And there are hundreds of colonias throughout southeast Texas, really up to about Laredo, and some in El Paso. Workers at dawn waiting for work on the border. You can see the vegetable and citrus trucks there, and labor agencies. Antonio Orendine, who was a protege of Cesar Chavez and was an activist in the Valley for a long time, and Peavy, a Texas Ranger. On the left is in the valley, the Corona lady, we called her, funeral wreaths, and the Big Bend area on the right. He didn't get the best horse, but for the old time and big Anglo ranchers, I mean, you have to be a big rancher to make any money off cattle in the Big Bend area. I think it was 340 acres to a cow, something like that, because there's just not enough rain. And it's very lonely. It was, maybe not so much. And this is pre-Marfa. And what many people don't remember is that Scottish and British banks were the major supporters of the cattle industry in Texas, both in the Panhandle and down here as well, because the British Empire desperately needed meat and leather. Kids would come from, this was near Redford in Presidio County, and kids would come across the river every day for school. So this is sort of a mixture of kids that came across the river illegally. And a picture of George Washington over their heads, and Presidio on the right, the largest town in that area. Crop dusting in the southeast Texas, and a landscape in southwest Texas. So I'm just going to, if my legs hold out, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our relationship with the Menil. Fred and I had the exhibition in the 70s. We were going back to New York or stay in Texas to do the first book. And it was because of the vision of the Menils, the excitement was what they, and this was particularly Dominique. I never knew Jean, and he had died by the time we came. But the vision about art as central to personal and civic life, and essential to our culture as Americans, and a belief in the importance of artists, that made us decide to take a stand in Houston. And Dominique very kindly offered us one of her houses that Rebecca referred to for $200 a month. But it was part of her idea of the Deauville for artists in the middle of Houston. And since that time, we did many things together with Paul Winkler. I thought was a wonderful curator. We did 2 FotoFest collaborations, groundbreaking. One, Kurdistan in the Shadow of History, very famous book and project by Susan Meisel. It traveled to 12 places in Europe and the US after the Menil, and it merited 2 or 3 visits from Turkish security intelligence people. Luckily, the Menil guards were very smart, knew how to handle them. And the other was Cuba, the new generation, and it was the first generation of photographers after the revolutionary generation. And both of those shows were over a couple of years in Richmond Hall. And the Cuban show attracted a large protest that said, Menil, supporter of dictatorships, Fred and Wendy, Castro buddies. And Fred was very clever, maybe what we should be doing with Putin. He invited them to come in and look at the work. And these photographers were very revolutionary in the way they used photography, but they were not followers of the revolution. They were very cleverly critical of what had happened over 20 years of revolution in Cuba. So all the protesters invited the Cuban photographers. We managed to get visas for all of them, thanks to a creative economics deputy that we had in Cuba at the time from the US, and asked them to go to church. Well, none of the Cuban photographers did, accepted that invitation. But it was a show that has made international stars out of at least half of those people, of the photographers. And there were projects in Salvador and in Paris that we did together with Dominique. One of our closest friends in Houston was Miles Glazer, about whom Don talked. He was quite a remarkable man and very important, I think, in the development of, in the 70s and early 80s, of Menil in Houston. And so I am very happy to again be able to reconnect, on several layers, thanks to Rebecca and her team at the Menil. Thank you very much for tonight, and thank you for this. And just before I close, and if I can manage to get out of here on two legs, I want to ask our close friend and a poet here, Jane Creighton, who teaches at the University of Houston downtown, to read a poem from her recent published book. Jane. Now, I am going to, I know, I'm just, yes, a lot of standing. Just be careful of your nerves when you get older. Yeah.
Okay. I just love Wendy and Fred, and I'm always kind of a weeper, so I'm just going to try not to do that too much, but I just love them, and this is a friendship that for over 2 decades has just lifted me up in all sorts of ways, and when I say that, I just know deeply how true that is in so many diverse ways for so many people in this room and beyond. So it's really quite an honor for me to be able to read this poem that Wendy asked for Fred, and for Wendy, and for everyone here. It's the closing poem of this book. Supplicant. Let me have the love it takes to live inside this dream where you and you and you and you are walking a road. It leads down to a lake I know, banked by granite boulders and pine, and I am also with you and you and you and you walking one by one and together, as if we had always been friends who loved one another in the same place at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely beautiful. And Wendy, how amazing to relive some of your memories through the photographs. Whitney, I invite you to walk out with Wendy, and if everyone in the audience could please wait for Wendy to get outside, and then we would like to invite you to join us at a reception. All of you have stories and memories of Fred, and it will be wonderful to share them with one another. That's the great thing about gathering in person. We just want to make sure that Wendy can get outside before you start to come up to her with the stories, or she'll never get a drink. So thank you for coming today. And again, if you could just let her get out the door before you do, that would be great. Thank you.